Would you know if a 15-centimeter nail penetrated your foot? In 1995, a construction worker fell off some scaffolding in New York City, found that he'd fallen onto a 15-centimeter nail, which had pierced the work boot entirely. The construction worker was in great pain, was given fentanyl and midazolam for the pain, was taken by the paramedics to hospital, where it turned out that the nail had passed cleanly between the toes. The boot itself was severely injured, but the toes were entirely intact. And yet, the construction worker had been in genuine great pain, needed the fentanyl in order to have the nail gently removed. What's going on? So that's a dramatic case. It's a little sort of anecdotal case in the British Medical Journal, 1995. But what I want to do today is just to convince you that regardless of dramatic cases like that, all of our experience, moment by moment, is constructed in something like that way. It's constructed by some weird mixture of what we expect to be experiencing, like great pain because I've seen this great big nail go right through my work boot, and what the sensory information, the information from the nociceptors in this case, is actually delivering. And I think everything that we experience is built in that way. And in some of these sort of false perspective pictures, you can see photographers playing around with your brain's predictions about what's what. So the picture I want to put on the table is about brains as prediction machines. I think that's a fundamental thing that a brain is. It's a prediction machine that is busy predicting all kinds of different stuff, not just what you see, what you hear, but what's going on in your body as well, and also, of course, what you might be doing in the near future. But a lot of it's about predicting the present, although that kind of sounds. And we don't realize the extent to which this is going on, mostly because the predictions are normally unconscious. Loads, you make a few conscious predictions. We'll come back to those later. But most of what really matters here is going on unconsciously. And you have very little control over that. So here's a demo. Those of you that are sitting there can probably see this demo okay. It's a so-called hollow mask illusion. So this is an ordinary kind of, sort of like a joke shop mask, I guess. It's Einstein in this case. And this is the hollow side of the mask. Now, those of you sitting back there, that side's probably looking fairly convex to you, probably looking a bit like a normal face, but if I rotate carefully, there we go, that's the normal face side. And then we come around, I'll try and do it for people on the side in a minute. And then we come around and that's the concave side. Now I'm just going to do this now. Let's try and do this since we brought all this high-tech apparatus with us. Here we go, for people over there. That's the concave side there, right? And you're going to be difficult, aren't you? How's that going to work? Hold on. There, you getting there? Yeah. Right. Cool. Okay. Excellent. If all that down now, that was the difficult bit. Gone off without much of a hitch. That's good. So what is going on there? Your brain is getting perfectly good, when you're looking at the concave side, your brain is getting perfectly good information saying that that is a concave side. No lack of information being transmitted to the brain there. On the other hand, a bit of your brain is kind of saying that faces aren't like that. I know a lot about faces. Faces are convex. That's just what a face is, particularly a famous face. I've seen it lots of times. And that prediction of convexity is kind of trumping all that real sensory information that is coming in from vision, in this case. So in a way, this is a good thing. Your brain is kind of trying to sort the signal out from the noise, using what it knows about the world. But sometimes it gets things wrong as a result, as when you're looking at the concave side of the mask, or if you happen to be falling onto a 15-centimeter nail. And there's that was in case it didn't work. So, let's go through this bit now. That was another version. Right. So, I think we will have all experienced something in this ballpark if you've ever experienced phantom phone vibrations. You've probably experienced that feeling of the phone going off in your pocket, even when it's actually not in your pocket, or it's turned off, or nobody's calling you. They're very common. I actually get phantom wrist vibrations now, thanks to the Apple Watch. My phantom wrist vibrations are very clever now, because if I start walking quickly, I expect the watch to give me a double little ping saying, hey, you're exercising. And I feel that, even if I'm walking quickly and I'm not wearing the watch. It's really weird. So I think we do all experience our predictive brains in action. What we don't realize is how much of everything that we experience is like that. That's mostly what I'm going to be talking about. There's a recipe for phantom phone vibrations. They're extremely common in people that are strongly expecting a call. No big surprise there. Medical interns, for example, have a very high incidence of phantom phone vibrations. They're exacerbated by stress and caffeine. And both of these mess around with dopaminergic systems that we'll return to later, because dopamine is a big player in the predictive brain, and other neurotransmitters. We'll come to that. But there's a little recipe for getting phantom phone vibrations. I'm going to do one more demo, if it works. This one is sine wave speech. So what's going on in sine wave speech is there's an ordinary speech recording, and then it is stripped of a lot of the usual acoustic information. So you get a kind of skeletal version. It sounds a little bit like the clangers. Anybody that remembers the clangers, it's a British thing. If you're not British, don't worry about this. But back in whenever it was, there were these things on the moon, and they kind of went, kind of like that. And that's what sine wave speech sounds like when you hear it the first time. What you'll experience here is very rapid learning on the part of the brain. So I'll play you the sine wave sentence, I'll play you the real sentence, the non-stripped down one, then you'll hear the sine wave one again. And all I want you to do is just appreciate the difference in your experience, the huge difference to your phenomenology, as we philosophers sometimes say, that a good prediction can make. So here we go. Start.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Real sentence coming up.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Same sine wave again.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Should sound very, very different. We'll do one or two more.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
One more.
He was sitting at his desk in his office.
He was sitting at his desk in his office.
So if you listen to those kinds of recordings enough, you become a native speaker of sine wave speech. You can play me a brand new recording, I'll hear it fine. It's just, oh yeah, I know what that is. So when we hear speech sounds in our ordinary language, we're performing the same kind of trick. You hear spaces between the words, or sometimes, I'm not talking this quickly, you hear spaces between the words that I'm saying, but if you look at the actual acoustic signal, it's pretty much continuous. Those spaces are inserted by the predictive brain because it's correctly predicting that there are word boundaries there. So everything that we experience is built this way. This was in case that demo didn't work. It's a visual version of the same thing. See what's going on now, see that one again. So what this suggests, to use a phrase that comes up in this literature, is that perception is a kind of controlled hallucination. The brain is continuously trying to guess what's most likely to be coming at it from both introception and extroception. And so it's using a model to do that guessing. And what you experience is then a kind of mixture of what the brain was predicting and what the sensory evidence is telling you. So I think one moral of this account is that you never experience raw sensory information. You always experience prediction in some form or other. So imagine a world in which the local weather forecast made a little difference to the actual weather in that region. That's a weird kind of world, and let's not even think about what goes on in the borderlines between regions and things. But, a confident forecast of rain made rain itself just a little bit more likely. A confident forecast of sun made sun itself just a little bit more likely. We don't live, unfortunately, in that kind of weather world. But I think that this is the experiential world we live in. Our confident forecasts tweak our own experience in the direction of the forecast. Now, people have said things like this for a long time. There's stuff like this in Immanuel Kant's kind of constructivist picture of perception and experience. It's really super clear in Hermann von Helmholtz, the idea that perception is a product of an unconscious inference. And in the 20th century, Ulrich Neisser, Richard Gregory, and others, the analysis by synthesis movement had the same sort of picture. And here's Richard Gregory delivering the Christmas lectures, I think, here in 1979. So I feel very as if I should have more bangs and whistles. That was all I had. Yeah. So what's new now? Well, since about 2005, what's new, I think, is a comprehensive neuroscientific theory of all these effects. And it's actually a theory that deals not just with perception, but with action too. Tonight's not long enough for me to give you the account of action, but it will be important in discussion, I imagine. So maybe, one of the pioneers of this is Carl Friston at UCL here in London. 2005 published a theory of cortical responses, which was beginning the hard work of turning these sort of intuitions into a story that was both computationally clear and also neurophysiologically plausible. And that's sort of where we are now with it, I think. So much so that lots of people are writing books about it, me included. I'm selling one, The Experience Machine. So there are lots of good books about this out there. My colleague Anil Seth has one. An early one by Jakob Hui, The Predictive Mind, wonderful book. Lisa Feldman Barrett's book on how emotions are made. A big stress there on interoceptive prediction, predicting the states of our own body and the importance of that. My own earlier book, and the current sort of Bible, the Active Inference Bible, because I'll call it predictive processing. Lots of other people call it active inference, which I find a bit clumsy, but it's the same thing. So what I'm going to do is introduce, as it says, a sketch of a part of the theory, and then look at some applications in computational psychiatry, a particular interest of mine. What might these accounts say about both neurotypical and atypical forms of experience, and then look at some puzzles and challenges towards the end. So, what did I do there? The more traditional view had perception as something that works from the outside in. You get this in Descartes, all those beautiful drawings of energies hitting the eyes, impressing things like little tubes, almost like little wax impressions going deeper and deeper into the brain. Eventually something cool happens at the pineal gland, but we won't worry about that. But it was all outside in. Perception was the world coming in from the outside and making a richer and richer impression on the brain. And this picture came through in 20th century neuroscience, where most textbooks, leading textbook, when it's talking about vision, has all of the arrows moving inwards from the sensory peripheries deeper into the brain. In artificial intelligence, David Marr had a basically feed-forward processing picture of vision, super influential, wonderful work. But predictive processing turns a lot of it upside down. Most of the brain's work is being done from the inside out. That huge metabolic budget that we'll come back to soon is mostly in the business of keeping your model alive and using that model to make predictions. Just like, a weather forecast needs a weather model to make predictions, your brain needs a model of the world to make predictions. So, brains like that predicting the present. The consequence of that is a very efficient and interesting thing, is that in order to get to grips with the world, all the brain needs to do is deal with the errors in its own predictions. So if I'm busy predicting a certain kind of visual scene, and I'm getting information from the world that is consistent with my prediction, I don't need to do anything. This is all as expected. But if I get prediction errors, stuff that I've been unable to predict, then something ought to happen. ideally. So prediction error signals are a sort of anti-hero almost of these accounts. They carry the news. They are the sensory information that is currently unexplained. So they are a form of sensory information. They're just that particular bit of it that is currently unexplained by the brain's best ongoing predictions. They carry the news. And what do you use them for? You use them to select better predictions. So if I'm going to see something that I didn't expect to be there, then I better get a flurry of prediction error, use that prediction error to recruit a better bit of the model, a bit of the model that has a plastic yellow duck or something in it, so that I can get to grips with the unexplained bits of sensory information. And that's sort of how these models actually sort of look if you're schematically drawing them. Thing to take away from that is just that these are multi-level models. The brain's not just kind of sitting there making one prediction. I don't know, what shall I have? Computer, laptop on the table. Instead, high levels are making predictions about, I know, something's going on. Low levels are making predictions about the precise details of the arrangement of stuff on the screen. And each intermediate layer is trying to predict the layer below it. So, just like you might use information, stuff you know about sentences to predict stuff about words, and stuff you know about words to predict stuff about letters, and stuff you know about letters to predict the distribution of ink on a page. So it'd be a bit like that. So it's super efficient. You use the active world model to make an educated guess, and if the guess doesn't accommodate trusted, and we'll come back to that in a minute, bits of sensory information, prediction error is your friend, and it ought to improve your guessing. It's super efficient. It's used in commercial motion compressed video, for example. That goes back to 1959, where people realized that you don't need to send the information in the next frame of a video if it's more or less the same as the frame before it. All you need to do is send the difference. So if someone's running against a static background, just send the information about the difference in where their legs are going. Let the background stay the same. Suppose you also knew their gait, just how they were running. Then you don't even need to update where their legs are going, because you predicted that too. So you can get as clever as you want about this. The cleverer you are, the more efficient you are. And I think this helps us make sense of what's a really, really puzzling fact about the brain. The neuronal connections in the brain that run, as they sometimes say, top down, from deep in the brain towards the sensory peripheries, they greatly outnumber the ones carrying information inwards. That's a bit of a surprise on the perception is a big thing, we're doing it all the time and it's all from the outside in. It's not. It's mostly from the inside out. And prediction errors just kind of tidy up around the edges. It's a picture here. So, for example, at least 90% of the input to lateral genicular nucleus, which is just after the retina, comes from deeper in the brain. On average, throughout cortex, these outflowing pathways outnumber the inflowing pathways by at least 2 to 1, and in some areas by 4 to 1. So it's the brain is wired from the inside out, and these kinds of accounts make a lot of sense of that wiring. So the anomaly is resolved, the hard work's being done from the inside out, and hey, no wonder the brain is spending an awful lot of energy all the time, even when it's at rest, because it's maintaining the world model. It's maintaining a model that can be used to make these very detailed predictions. It's as if you're constantly running a simulation of reality in your brain. Well, you are running a simulation of reality. In fact, you're experiencing one right now. And if I do something unexpected, I'll just give it a few prediction errors. I don't know. There we go. There we go. So, prediction error anchors the brain's imaginings, if you like, the brain's constructions to the world. But this raises a puzzle question. If the brain can do this, if it really can use flurries of prediction error to rapidly correct its own guessing, why do we sometimes get things wrong? You know, what happened with the worker that fell on the 15-centimeter nail? You know, there was no nociceptive pain information coming from the toe where they were feeling the pain to the brain. Why didn't the brain then immediately get prediction errors and correct its guessing? Indeed. So, this brings us to what I think is arguably the most important bit of the contemporary picture. It's something that wasn't there in the earlier versions of this story. What it is the idea that the balance between prediction and sensory information is never fixed. It's something that the brain itself has to estimate moment by moment. So your brain is estimating how much to take account of certain predictions, how much to take account of certain bits of apparently sensory counter-evidence. You know, in the case of the hollow mask, your brain's ignoring a lot of sensory counter-evidence because it's really confident in its predictions, which, of course, again, is interesting from the perspective of you, because you know it's a hollow mask, but you're still seeing it the other way around, because those intermediate levels of processing are just absolutely convinced of the convexity. Where are we then? Go on. So it's a kind of weighting game. The brain is estimating how much confidence it has in certain predictions or certain bits of sensory information. This is known as precision weighting. And the precision weighting game is kind of a zero-sum game. So if I up the precision on my predictions, I am lowering the precision on the bits of sensory evidence that are meeting those predictions, and vice versa. And this is happening at every level of processing, and if these accounts are right, in every area of the brain. They're probably not all processing predictions and prediction errors in quite the same way. The amygdala's got its own special thing to do. But that's kind of what they're all doing if these accounts are on track. We'll come back to that question. Yeah. So on a foggy day, for example, you might not want to rely too much on what your eyes are telling you, particularly if you know the area, you've got a great model of the world. It's like, I'm going to rely on my model and just, I'll take some account of the visual information, but not too much. So in the brain, the idea is that this precision weighting economy centers on the complex neurotransmitter system. So all of the things there, dopamine, noradrenaline, acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, they're all there somewhere, serotonin. So that's a big bit of the precision weighting economy is being done by complex neurotransmitter systems. It's also being done probably on faster, or definitely on faster timescales by the neuronal phase, by the temporal phase of neuronal oscillations, low versus fast frequencies of neuronal oscillation. We'll come back to those towards the end, if there's time. So, precision increases the influence of particular predictions or particular bits of sensory information. It's kind of what attention is. If these accounts are right, then what attention really is variable precision weightings going on in the brain, which I think is kind of useful. We all use this word attention. No one really knows exactly what it is. There's a proposal here. That's what attention is. It's exactly that. This is a Mooney image. It's a bit like the woman with the horse earlier. Yeah, I don't know if you can see this one, but here's the actual image. And here's a Mooney again. Right. Now, I think that what we can take away from these things is that predictive brains have a very, very delicate job to do. They have to tread a very fine line. If you're going to spot the hidden frog, you've got to up the precision on an awful lot of bits of information about froggy contours in particular, and you downgrade other bits of information. That's kind of what's going on when you allow the frog can, I was going to say jump out at you. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's because we can do this delicate precision weighting that predictive brains are good detectors of faint patterns in worlds full of noise. So, it's important to get these weightings right, and if they go wrong, very bad things will happen. That's what that's trying to say. You know, if your brain starts to misestimate the value of certain predictions, or to overestimate the value of certain bits of sensory information, then bad things will happen. And we'll look at a few of those bad things in the next half hour. At this point, though, you might also be asking, well, can't it just get the balance right? You know, that's actually a very tough question. We may come back to it in discussion, because I would say there's no right balance. There is no balance such that that balance will always reveal how things are, because it all depends on the kind of world you happen to be living in at that time, how volatile it is, what's going on there. So I don't think there's any right answer to how this balancing act can be done. There are some ways it can change. So Computational psychiatry, as it appears through the lens of this account, is mostly a matter of trying to see how differences in that precision-weighted balancing act might generate different profiles of experience. That's pretty well what's going on in an awful lot of work. I think it's a good way of bringing together a systematic understanding of a lot of atypical experiences, the wide range of typical experience, and also what happens under the effects of psychedelic drugs, for example, which we won't get to. So, for example, suppose you assign a very high weighting to the sensory evidence. Very, very high weighting to sensory evidence. What's that going to do to you as a prediction machine? One thing it's going to do is it's going to make it harder for you to detect faint patterns in a noisy environment. To detect faint patterns in a noisy world, you want your model of how things are to be sort of, I don't know, taking a firm hand over the sensory evidence. Your model is what's going to give you the best grip on things, probably. So there's a lot of interesting work now suggesting that autism spectrum condition involves just this kind of overweighting of the sensory evidence. That, in fact, it's very much enhanced sensory evidence is the kind of profile that is emerging from quite a lot of detailed studies here. And there's a very interesting side debate that I won't go into, but it's a side debate about whether what's going on is weakened influence of the models or heightened influence of the sensory information. From a Bayesian perspective, these are going to look very, very similar, but they won't look quite the same, and the evidence is now strongly suggesting that autism spectrum condition is not about weakened model use, it's actually about enhanced sensory information. So what would happen if you're enhancing sensory information like that? Well, a lot of environments will seem difficult to negotiate. You may become wary of noisier, hard-to-predict environments. Social worlds where lots of very small cues really matter might be especially challenging. So again, one thing that comes out of these accounts is if there is a sort of social understanding difficulty in autism spectrum condition, it's a side effect of the real thing, which is enhanced sensory information. It's not a fundamental thing. So I think that's quite interesting. It also makes sense of the cases where people with autism spectrum condition just do better. So stuff like the embedded figures task, where you're showing something and asked to find the geometric figure in the thing there, the rocking horsey thing, whatever it is. People with autism spectrum condition do better at that than neurotypicals, probably because they're better at allowing the sensory information to speak for itself. No, they're not getting waylaid too much by that sort of strong top-down, it's whatever it is. I don't know what that is, actually. Rocking horse thing. Right. So now, imagine something different. Imagine that instead of assigning extra weight to the sensory information, you assign extra weight to some of your own predictions. What's going to happen then? It's pretty obvious what's going to happen then. At that point, you really do start to hallucinate things. You know, you've taken some of the control out of controlled hallucination, and you've just got hallucination. And, you know, I think we all do a bit of this. This is why we see faces in the clouds and things like that, because we can have strong predictions about faces, and if we just allow a certain sort of relaxation to happen, you can do this spotting. So there are accounts of delusions and hallucinations in schizophrenia and psychosis that are emerging at about this point, where the idea is that there's a kind of overweighting of unconscious predictions, and that in turn might arise if you're having false prediction errors. If for some reason the brain is generating false prediction errors, then you're going to have to come up with some sort of model to try to deal with this stuff that is kind of saying to you, this is important, you're not getting this, this is important stuff, revise your model. So the model gets revised, it becomes very firm, and then it can alter experience, pulling it in its own direction, just like with the hollow mask illusion. Yeah. So they become highly weighted. These can be predictive models of complex conspiracies, impersonations. Nowadays, it's the internet. The internet is the source of a lot of these models. At that point, a strong prediction is altering your experience in a way that then seems to confirm the model that is making the predictions. And that's something that I think is really important to get to grips with, the tendency of predictive brains to get locked into spurious cycles of self-confirmation, where your own predictions are changing the way you sense the world, and then you think, oh, I'm getting evidence for the model that I'm using to make these predictions, but that evidence is spurious. I think we have effects like that in daily life, actually. Our own unconscious expectations alter the way that we see things and experience things, and we think we're getting evidence for our own models. So that's a kind of Achilles heel, I think, of the predictive brain, spuriously self-confirming predictions, but it will also turn out to be something that we might be able to turn to our advantage. I'll come back to that later. Checking the time, yeah. So, as just one experimental demo of these sorts of spuriously self-confirming cycles, a little bit of work where subjects they had expectations created in them by teaching them to associate a particular geometric cue with higher or lower levels of heat, as indicated by the little thermometer thing. So, in the induction phase, as they called it, expectations were put in place so that if you saw this geometric cue, you're associating it with low heat. If you see the other one, you're associating it with high heat. In phase 2 of the experiment, real heat stimuli are applied to people's bodies following the geometric cues. So now they're actually getting some heat, but unbeknownst to them, the applied heat levels are all exactly the same. So they get the geometric cue, they already associate it with more or less heat, but they're actually getting exactly the same amount of heat. Now, as you might expect, subjects reported the expectation-induced effects, more or less pain, in line with the induced expectations, the geometric cues. And they supported this. They didn't just ask them this question. It was supported by something called the neurologic pain signature, a slightly contentious fMRI profile for something like real pain is going on rather than I'm just reporting what I think you want to hear me report. So they did that as well as a report. So that explains, I think, why they didn't update. This is what I think is interesting here. You should be asking yourself, but why don't you update? You're given the same heat. Can't you just feel it and update your model? But you can't, because your model is making you feel more or less heat, and so you think you're getting more evidence for your model. You certainly don't think you're getting counter-evidence for your model. So I think it's a nice example, just a simple sort of controlled example of the way experience, when it's shaped by prediction, can get locked into these sorts of spuriously self-confirming cycles. As they say, expectations modify pain perception, and this modified perception drives subsequent expectations, so you maintain the misguided ones, even when you've got good sensory evidence to the contrary. So what I want to do now is to see how cycles like this could be at work in stuff that's maybe a little bit closer to home. Chronic pain is the example that I'll start with here. So somewhere between a third and half of the population of the UK at least experience chronic pain. So it's a huge health burden. So there's a puzzle in chronic pain. I mean, chronic pain, as you all know, is kind of defined as a sort of longer-term version of pain. It's not the acute pain that you get when you fracture an ankle or something. This is something that's been going on for a while. So the match between the experience of chronic pain and identified standard causes is only high for acute and localized things like, the fractured ankle and so on. If you move to longer-term conditions, the match is very bad. And there's a lot of examples of this. Reported breathlessness in pulmonary disease, discomfort with atrial fibrillation, asthma, cancer-related fatigue, lower back pain a very, very striking example. These are all cases where the amount of pain experienced just doesn't sit very well with the peripheral etiology, if you like, what seems to be going on structurally in the relevant bits of the body. And this isn't just across different patients, this is across the same patient at different times as well. So it's a huge amount of variation for what's apparently pretty much the same level of sort of basic structural bodily damage. And it affects the same person at different times too. I think this, is that me? No. Ah. You got the same ringtone as me, you're just panicking me here. That's it. That's right. So, yes, wide variation in experienced pain. I think this falls into place really, really well from a predictive processing perspective. I mean, what goes on over those longer time spans? One thing that goes on is you've got an awful lot of time to form expectations about how your experiences of pain are going to vary across different contexts. Different life histories will also do this differently. So I think that we can expect different life histories to differently balance that sort of precision-weighted balancing act. And sort of random things that happen contextually, like, I don't know, you experience an asthma attack in a particular kind of context, that could make it more likely to experience it in another context, given the role of prediction in those events. So they can become highly sensitive to context, and I think that can happen even when the context turns out not to actually be clinically relevant. The longer you live with a condition, the longer you've got for things like that to start to happen. It's not surprising. So this is just kind of like, this is kind of the same thing again about predictions changing experience, and then you think that you're getting evidence for the model that you're using to make the predictions even when you're not. I do think this is part of the puzzle of chronic pain, and it's something that we can begin to address. Let's get to that. So no one there is saying that the chronic pain isn't, as it were, really experienced as pain. Of course it is, you know, just like the person that fell on a nail was experiencing excruciating pain. So far it will seem like bad news. It just seems like, you know, predictive brains are good, they're rather efficient, but they're getting us into all sorts of nasty little corners. What can we do about that? So there's some good news, with apologies to John Krasinski. I think there's a kind of opportunity here to push back against the bad predictions and install different predictions that might be helpful. They might even be spuriously helpful in a certain sort of way. You know, maybe it's a trick in just the same sort of way. So I'm going to end by looking at some of those interventions, emerging chances to sort of hack the predictive brain in a good direction. So there's an obvious example, the careful use of placebos, a very interesting area, I think. It's known that the efficacy of placebos varies a lot. It varies basically according to how confident the patient can become of relief from the placebo. You can get this by differently describing the potency of the thing that you're being given. You can also get it by doing placebo surgery, for example, instead of just a placebo pill. Placebo surgery is very effective for certain things. Mostly, I think, because we think surgery is pretty serious. You know, I think that's a pretty serious intervention. I'm expecting something from this. Or at least that's, I think, what the brain's thinking. So patients receiving placebo surgery for osteoarthritis of the knee report similar relief to those undergoing normal surgery, and they get more relief than people given placebos, pills or coaching. So, you know, pretty good studies here. Athletes show improved performance when hooked up to what they think are pure oxygen delivery systems, when in fact they're just air. They also show improved performance if they're given a drug that they're told will increase red blood cell amounts, even though it doesn't. Yeah, it's a 1.5% increase, which is big if you're an elite athlete. So there's obviously tempting ways to get around the doping laws here. Interesting to me that honest placebos work too. An honest placebo is one where you're told, this is a placebo, there's no standard clinically active ingredient here. But nonetheless, a lot of people report significant amounts of relief. I think that's just another, excuse me, gone too far. I think that's just another manifestation of the fact that most of the predictions are unconscious. That, if you're given something that comes out of a nice little sort of bubble wrap thing by someone authoritative in a white coat, then even if you know it's a placebo, mid-levels of your neural processing don't. It's like, oh yeah, this is going on. So another sort of systematic kind of pushback here is something called pain reprocessing theory. It's very interesting and promising, I think. So to get into this sort of bit of the account, we need to think that the basic experience of pain is it has a sort of role to play, and that role is telling us that our bodies are in imminent danger, that if we keep on doing what we're doing, this is not going to be good. And that's true. If you've just fractured your ankle, you don't want to, keep walking on that right now. It's a very cyborgy ankle there. I don't know what's going on there. But in a lot of these cases of chronic long-term pain and disability, it seems like the prediction of imminent bodily damage has become the problem, if you like. What's got locked in is an expectation that if you continue doing stuff, it's really going to be bad for you. That's a big component of what pain is. On these accounts at least, is that very expectation. So, as people do say in this literature, your experience of pain there's a little bit like a malfunctioning warning light in a car. It's a bit like, that light's going on, it's saying, you better pull into the side of the road right now, don't keep doing this. Looks like you've got to stop what's going on. But suppose it's a warning light that's malfunctioning. And of course, what's interesting here is if you think of a warning light malfunction, you probably think, oh, there's a bit of wiring that's gone wrong. But in the predictive processing accounts of warning light malfunctions, there's not even a wiring problem. It's just a sort of balancing act problem. There's nothing structurally wrong with the wiring of the brain. So I think it's an interesting sort of software problem, if you like. So chronic back pain, case I mentioned earlier, in 85% of cases, there's no standard peripheral cause. That's not to say that there's no cause. It's just not a cause that matches up to the pain. What pain reprocessing theory is trying to do is to reframe the pain in a way that pushes back against those predictions. Basically involves doing a talk a bit like this, I suppose. So saying that chronic pain, might be that kind of false alarm involving locked-in predictions, but then trying to install different predictions, mostly by getting people to do a little bit more despite the pain. And oddly enough, doing more makes experiential pain become less. So it's a little bit as if just by driving the car a bit more, you could make the warning light get a little bit dimmer, which is, I think, that's the trick that we want. There's a very nice documentary called This Might Hurt on that I think you can probably still get on Netflix or Prime. So this will be a helpful cycle. This, I think, is the flip side of all those unhelpful cycles where expectations tweak experience in kind of bad and self-entrenching ways. This is a way of tweaking experience that might be helpful and become entrenched in a good way. So the best systematic study here is Asher et al., 2022 and 2023, study of chronic back pain, report and neuroimaging, as mentioned earlier. And basically, they just found that it works. Large and sustained reductions in pain and disability following PRT as compared with both placebo and usual care in about 73% of cases. So it's promising for chronic back pain, a particular kind of pain. Okay, how am I doing for time? Oh, this is interesting. I may just have time to do what I wanted to do. Imagine. Let's see. So another example is functional neurological disorders, sometimes called psychosomatic or psychogenic. Those terms not so much in use now. Functional neurological disorders, neurological symptoms without standard structural causes. So, chronic pain actually is an FND by this definition. At least 16% of new referrals to neurology clinics are diagnosed in the end with some form of functional neurological disorder, meaning basically that you can't find anything. So examples included unexplained cases of blindness, deafness, pain, fatigue, weakness, abnormal gait, tremor, seizure. Functional problems are normally diagnosed by variabilities of impairment. So typically stuff like distracting attention from a particular bodily part can reveal intact abilities in that part. There's something, Hoover's sign works that way. I won't have time to go into these examples, but one example we can do. This is an example shared with me by John Stone, ex-colleague up in Edinburgh. This is Ms. A, who had a slow but eventually total loss of vision. She'd had severe migraines before, but she'd had no other history of stress, trauma, abuse, head injury, anxiety, nothing really, just severe migraines. fMRI was normal. What Stone noticed, though, was that when she was talking to him about her total blindness, she was copying his bodily movements and would sometimes follow his gaze. All the while, absolutely not experiencing anything visually, not consciously. But she could do gaze following and movement copy, and that's a rather strong clue that there's something more intact there than you might imagine. Her eyes responded normally to an optokinetic drum, so that's just a thing that it kind of extracts a nystagmus response from the eyes, and so they kind of twitch a bit in response to the change in pattern. So she exhibited the normal pattern of response with the optokinetic drum. Stone and colleagues conjectured that the severe migraines had basically made her brain start to constantly predict darkness. Now, she'd spent a lot of time retreating from the migraines into darkened places. She'd begun to, they thought, just expect darkness. Her experience then had to fit in with that expectation, be a little bit like your experience of the hollow mask or phantom phone vibrations, all of these things that we all experience, just a rather dramatic version. So the treatment there was to try and push back a bit, just like pain reprocessing theory, really, against those hidden predictions. One thing that Stone and colleagues did was just share the science of predictive brains and how predictions, locked-in predictions, can affect experience. Also, when I say shared videos with people she trusted, because she couldn't see the videos. She's still functionally blind. Also induced experiences of flashes of light using transmagnetic cranial stimulation. So, the big thing that looks like a wind-up mechanical toy thing that applies a big pulse of magnetism to the brain. That can induce phosphenes, and so that's kind of proving to her brain. That's the idea. It's proving to the brain that seeing is possible. So she made a full recovery. Of course, you don't know whether those things were responsible for the recovery. You never know. Might have just recovered anyway. But she did recover. And the main message today is that these are just extreme examples of the way that we're all constructing our sensory experience all the time. Functional neurological disorders are just a dramatic kind of manifestation of that thing that we're all doing all the time. And that's true even when there's a standard cause, when you've got illness, burns, other kinds of injury. So I think the more we appreciate this, the less resistance there ought to be to the diagnosis of functional neurological disorder. So one thing that happens right now is patients don't want to hear that. They really do not want to be told that they've got a functional neurological disorder. And I think that's because we've got the wrong metaphysical model of what it's like to be a normal human being. To be a normal human being is to build experience in just this way. So functional neurological disorders are just an extreme exemplar. Hopefully, getting these sorts of accounts on the table might help us see past old dualisms of mind and body, might even erode the distinction between psychiatric and neurological disorders altogether. Personally, I don't think it's a very helpful distinction. So more generally, lots of other promising ways to hack and nudge our predictive brains. Immersive virtual reality therapy for pain. This is very effective. It's used sometimes as an anesthetic during dentistry. There are good results when changing the dressings of burns patients. So this will be roughly in a sort of immersive VR, seeing an undulating jellyfish or something kind of nice and soothing like that. And I think what these accounts give you is it's not just distraction. You might think, oh, it's just distraction. And it is in a way, but now we understand what distraction is doing. Just like verbal reframing, another example, it's a way of altering those precision weightings and seeding different predictions. And all of this is going to change your experience. Verbal reframing, also very powerful. So, I get little tingles in my hands before, having plenty of them behind that door. And, I've tried to reframe that as chemical readiness to deliver a good performance rather than, hey, it's all going to crash and burn. And it does seem to help. So all of this stuff, I think, falls into place. Self-affirmation, verbal reframing, the therapeutic use of music, touch, and ritual. I think that we've got a systematic way of understanding that these are genuine and potent interventions. They're all nudging predictive brains. Meditation is another one I'm very interested in. My ex-postdoc, Mark Miller's done a lot of work on this. What he thinks meditation is doing is giving you greater control over the precision weighting mechanism. And you can kind of see how that might work. I can kind of enhance the sensory experience so that I sort of reduce the grip of models. I can allow things to drift or to become very precisely fixed. If we could get control over our own precision weighting mechanisms, we would have what my colleague Zoltan Dienes calls phenomenological control, which would be an amazing thing to have. You would be able to tweak your own experience in the ways that are best for you in your life. Right, 8 minutes to say what's missing. That should be enough, shouldn't it? So it's a very incomplete picture. Altering the brain's best predictions isn't going to heal a fracture. It's not going to cure a cancer. It's not going to kill a virus. So I don't think we know what the scope and limits of these effects are yet. Still to be determined. Clearly good for stuff like pain, anxiety, breathlessness, fatigue, sports performance, cancer-related fatigue. So, lots of clear applications and unknown boundaries. There are big individual differences in how effective some of these therapies are. Therapies like placebo, hypnotism, pain reprocessing theory. And there's some very, very interesting clues that there might be a genetic difference underlying that. So there's an enzyme called COMT, and COMT controls the metabolism of dopamine in the brain. So the more COMT you've got, the more you're kind of eating up dopamine. You can kind of see what might go on here. If you don't eat up so much dopamine, then if dopamine's a big player in the precision weighting game, you may have more phenomenological control. And that is in line with the results here, which is that people with high levels of genetically determined COMT are less susceptible to these things like placebos, hypnotism, PRT. So I think that's very interesting, sort of bringing this stuff right down to the molecular level and then all the way back up again to the experiential level. A big challenge is working out what the contents of the neuronal predictions are in different brain areas. That's really not that well known. There's nice work by the Lars Muckley lab up in Glasgow, and the title of his paper there says what it found. Scene representations conveyed by cortical feedback to early vision can be described by line drawings. So the idea there is that it's kind of line drawing level information being fed right back down. That he's got beautiful experiments suggesting that. Nice work on the amygdala recently. We need to uncover the detailed neuronal circuitry of prediction and error exchange. There's a lot of very cool, some wet neuroscience work finding explicit prediction error responses in layers 2 and 3 of mouse cortex. And that's got a nice sort of recent twist that I'm not going to mention for time. There's nice work on the role of alpha, beta versus gamma frequencies in communicating predictions and errors, with the idea that the fast gamma frequencies are carrying error through the system, and the slower alpha beta frequencies are carrying predictions down the system. This has even led to a suggestion for a particular implementation of these accounts, which is different to the standard one, and I won't go through that difference because time will trip me up and I won't get to the last bit of metaphysics if I do. But the idea there is just that you have the same neuronal circuits doing prediction error, but differently prepared by alpha, beta rhythms, which allow gamma through when they're not prepared. That didn't make sense, did it? Come back to that in discussion. Okay. I think at any rate, this is a good moment in the history of this account because we've got some competing stories about what the implementation is in the brain. And it's only when you settle on an implementation that you can really begin to test these stories properly. So you can play pin the tail on the Kuhnian cycle here. Where are these accounts in the cycle of pre-science, normal science, model drift, model crisis? I'm not going to give away where I think we are in that cycle, but certainly having competing implementation level proposals is a really important moment. Assessment of the evidence base, don't worry about that. Conceptual challenges. Is prediction really the most fundamental thing that brains are doing? Some people think that if it was, we'd all just crawl into a dark corner and stay there, making very successful predictions. There's a good way out of that dark corner, but I'd have to give you the account of action. But there'll be time in discussion, maybe. That's sometimes called the dark and room puzzle. What is the relationship between all those mid-level unconscious predictions and the top-level conscious predictions? Nobody knows. How does language fit into the predictive processing picture? Nobody knows. What about culture and the human-built environment? We build great worlds to think in. We build worlds that allow us to minimize different kinds of error to get our jobs done, like painting lines on roads or building large hadron colliders. And we have a nice big project on this at the moment that takes me out to Spain sometimes to look at dolmens in Galicia, so why not? Archaeologists, vision scientists, computational modelers, and cognitive philosophers like me working together to explore material culture and how the worlds we build change the jobs that predictive brains need to do, and how do these things really work together. We're going to have to worry a lot about this in the near future because predictive brains are now sharing their worlds with AI-based forms of predictive intelligence. We need to understand these new ecosystems, communities of mutually predicting agents. For some speculations on that, see work by the Versus AI group. Carl Friston, the person that did a lot of the work on active inference, is the chief scientific officer of that group, so keep an eye on them. Oh yeah, the hard problem. Why and how is conscious experience possible at all? You might have noticed the book's called The Experience Machine, but I didn't mention the hard problem. I think there are big clues. I go through them in the book, big clues that involve the account of introception, the body predicting its own bodily states, and the account of action. Action is a way of resolving prediction errors by changing the world in order to make some predictions come true. So once you get all those bits together, I think we nibble at the edges of the hard problem. So I think there's real progress. I tried to tell the sort of upbeat story in The Experience Machine. I think we're closing in on a principled multi-level science of, at the very least, the structure and variety of human experience. We've got a small set of factors, predictions, precisions, prediction errors, and they combine to yield these striking differences in experience. So I think that we're heading for a periodic table of experiential variation, one that captures neurotypical, atypical, and altered states. But at the very least, I think that this brings us a few steps closer to appreciating both the diversity and the continuity of human experience. Thank you.